Well, I'm going to evaluate two Class II preparations. I guess there may be more than that in this typodon, I don't know, but I'm just going to go around right now with the Explorer. And I'm feeling the each of the teeth in the posterior quadrant in the upper left. Obviously, judging from this scarf that's wrapped around my head, I can't see anything. But so I got past the molar here, and I'm on to the second premolar and the first premolar. So this would be 12. That's the canine right there. Here's 12. Okay, so we've got something going on 12 right here. And then 13 seems to be intact from the distal marginal ridge to the mesial marginal ridge. There's a box right next to it on 12DL. So I can feel this a little bit, and I can feel the dovetail going facially, and the wall at the marginal ridge is fairly straight, fairly parallel to the marginal ridge. If I slide the Explorer up that wall, it feels, it's certainly pretty close to 1.5 millimeters tall. And so that means that in that area the pulpal floor is at about the right depth. Sliding back toward the axial wall, there's I feel the isthmus. I can't tell if it's following the central groove or not, because of course there is no central groove, but I feel the lingual wall of the isthmus approaching the adjacent tooth, number 13, and then it takes a turn buccally a little bit. So now from the dovetail on the facial side of the isthmus, I'm trying to get an idea with the Explorer about how wide the isthmus is, and it doesn't feel super narrow, but it's not really wide either. I suspect it's more than 1 millimeter. So anyway, back to the pulpal floor. It's relatively smooth. It's a little step, but not too much. I'm getting to the axial pulpal line angle, and in the center of the axial pulpal line angle, I can feel a little bevel. It's not real sharp, so it's just a hint of a bevel there, and it seems to go from the facial side of the axial to the lingual side of the axial. Okay, going down gingivally, let's see. So the axial, let's see, get oriented again here. I'm trying to get an idea how sharp the internal line angles are. The lingual internal line angle feels well defined. Facial internal line angle feels also well defined. Don't know about exit angles yet, we'll deal with that in a minute. But the axial seems to have some curvature in the expected direction. We don't care about how tall the axial is, of course, but it seems to have a couple of millimeters of height. Okay, now when I come over back to the pulpal floor again and follow outward to the facial margin, around the outside of the tooth, get a sense of the contour of the outside of the tooth until I get to the margin. Trying to do it above the level of the pulpal floor so I can feel something related to the exit angle. So the facial margin, the wall seems to be fairly flat from the margin inward for a short distance, and then it Let's see, I'm going to get oriented again. Here's the dovetail. Okay, so back to the facial margin. Seems that, I guess that's going into the dovetail, okay. So I think the facial margin is not super cleanly defined, but I think the exit angles, if it's not 90 degrees, it may be a little bit obtuse. The clearance on the facial, so I'm going down gingivally now, and the tip of the explorer, if I have the explorer vertical, I can feel the tip of the explorer going past part of that margin. How much of the explorer is going through? I guess what I'd have to do is flip the explorer over and come down into that same area. Let's see. The other end of the explorer, I lost track of where I was. Okay, there's the dovetail. Pulpal flora. Okay, so here's that facial wall. Okay. Okay, so I'm feeling probably, seems like 5 millimeters or so of that explorer is fitting through that facial contact. So that's going to be a moderate overextension, maybe close to a major overextension. It's got to be at least 0.7 or 8 millimeters of clearance there. On the lingual side, so you have to get the right direction of the explorer. So that it doesn't get bound by just being in the wrong direction. I'm getting very little going through there at all, maybe just that tip. There's a little step on the prep probably near that margin too. You can also hear that. If I were to flip the explorer over and come from the inside in that area, yeah, it's hard to tell whether there's just no clearance or just a few tenths of a millimeter. I can't feel any of that explorer coming through at all. So my guess is there's either no clearance or just a tenth of a millimeter. Okay, so it's hard to evaluate the exit angle on the lingual, of course. I can't quite get to that margin, but I think it's, if I go above where the contact is, come around the outside of the tooth, and then try to swing it around into the prep above the level of the pulpal flora. As far as I can tell, the exit angle is probably pretty close to 90. And as we were saying at the beginning, that isthmus, when the lingual exit angle comes in, then the curve goes inward to try to preserve the lingual triangular edge before we get to the actual isthmus itself. Okay, gingival clearance. We've already decided that the axial wall's fairly reasonable. The feeling of the gingival floor is that it has a reasonable width. As far as gingival clearance goes, by the way, up to this point, I would guess that when this tooth was remounted to the typodont, that it was remounted, rotated a little bit to the facial, so the facial clearance got to be more, and the lingual clearance got to be less. If I were to turn it, I bet it would look better on both sides. But anyway, gingivally, I can feel the explorer go past the gingival margin, and at the closest point of approach between the gingival margin and the adjacent tooth, it seems like it's probably going past by about yeah, let's see. Have to find where it's closest to the adjacent tooth here gingivally. There's not very much of a gingival clearance on the lingual side because again that lingual wall is not extended very far. So the contact area is closer to the lingual wall, but it feels like that gingival floor. Let's get back again here. I think I'm feeling a little angulation on that gingival floor, but it's still, I think that there's not much more than a couple tenths of a millimeter of clearance gingivally right on the about where it's closest to the adjacent tooth, which is about a third of the way from the lingual wall. Okay, so I would guess it's inadequate extension, inadequate clearance gingivally. Probably would be a little bit of decalcification left there. Wouldn't take much more to get a little bit more clearance. I can feel the Explorer kind of go gingivally as it approaches that gingival margin, so it feels like it's getting some, getting a nice angle there, but the Explorer doesn't go past that margin like it does when you get out a little bit farther facially and all the way over toward the lingual side. Retentive features, retentive grooves just aren't quite there. Sharp internal line angles, but I'm not feeling significant retention on either one of these sides. Not getting a really great catch. Okay, so overall I think that it feels like it's a pretty decent prep. It meets most of the requirements. If we rotated it and got more clearance on the lingual and not so much on the buccal, and if we extended gingivally another few tenths of a millimeter, I think, maybe put in some retentive grooves. In this case, they might not be needed. The box is fairly small facial-lingually. The isthmus is not narrow, as I said, so it certainly might be possible that the restoration would survive without definite retentive grooves, but still, it's always a good idea. So probably the gingival clearance and lingual clearance are the areas that are of most concern on this one at this point. And 2, 3. Here's 4. And 5. Okay, so here's our prep. Now that last one, I wasn't really careful to make sure that I felt carefully around the location of that dovetail toward the marginal ridge. And this time when I go from the mesial margin right where the marginal ridge is, if I go to the top of that wall, the wall feels like it's a reasonable height, probably close to 1.5 millimeters, but when I go from the top of that wall, I cannot feel the surface of the tooth rising mesially to that wall, at least not significantly. That means that the wall itself, or the margin, is fairly close to the top of the marginal ridge, and that's not a good thing. I'd like to feel some definite surface of the tooth distal to the marginal ridge, between the margin and the top of the marginal ridge. I'm not quite feeling that here, so yeah, I'd like to see that a little bit less extended mesially. Okay, dovetail feels like it's significant. The pulpal floor is certainly rough. as I go from the mesial dovetail along the central groove, there's a slight irregularity of the pulpal floor. It doesn't seem to rise too much, but it seems to definitely be rising toward the distal. The walls facial lingually, as I get close to the axial wall, don't seem to be unusually short. So I think we're still okay as far as the overall pulpal depth is concerned. Of course, at the marginal ridge, with the wall 1.5 millimeters tall, or approximately, it certainly, since the wall got shifted toward the marginal ridge, it should be a little bit taller than 1.5 millimeters. Seems to be a little bit shorter toward the lingual than it is toward the buccal. So the dovetail might be shifted lingually at the same time, shifted a little bit distally, or mesially. Anyway, not a serious underextension pulpally as I go toward the distal because those walls are still pretty reasonably tall. Okay, so I'm in the box. Okay, so I'm feeling the axial facial line angle. Wait a minute, okay. Okay, something strange happening here. Let me see if I can sort this out. There's certainly very little in the way of facial clearance on this prep. Now, wait a second here. Yeah, there's a lack of gingival clearance toward the facial side. There's, okay, maybe that's what I was feeling. Get the direction I explore better. Okay, now I'm feeling the facial clearance. Okay, yeah, I was stuck underneath the gingival underextension a minute ago. Yeah, so it feels to me like there's at least 1 millimeter of facial clearance. So back to the gingival again. Trying to feel the facial wall down at the gingival floor. It feels very, very narrow. Let's go back to the occlusal. So the facial wall toward the occlusal has a concavity to it. So that means there's a hook at that margin. Using the hand instrument a little bit better would be great. So the axial facial line angle at the gingival. Well, now I'm feeling that width a little bit better between the axial wall and the facial margin going along the gingival facial line angle. That feels like it's a little bit more like 1 millimeter right now, but above that, that's where it gets interesting. Occlusal to that gingival margin, as I'm coming up toward feels like the axial wall is totally undercut. Okay, that's sort of throwing me off a little bit. So let's go back again, get reoriented. So the gingival part of the facial axial line angle, there's some width, but as the axial feels like it's undercut a lot, so that between the axial facial line angle and the facial wall of the box, there's not very much distance right there at all. Okay, let's see what's happening on the lingual side. It doesn't feel like there's so much of an undercut on the axial wall now. Still some, but nowhere near as much as there is on the buccal side. At the gingival margin, the width of the gingival floor on the lingual seems to be still pretty small. I think it's a little less than 1 millimeter, but as I'm going along the lingual wall, at the gingival there's a hook at that margin. There's a lot of clearance lingually. Let me get back to here again. Let me see. How much of this Explorer is going to fit through here? It feels like tons of it. But let's see. Let me make sure I've got this where it should be. No. Okay, so let me flip this over and approach it in a different way. Need to get underneath that contact on the lingual side a little bit better. Get the Explorer rotated the right way, so I'm down at the gingival. Okay, yeah, the Explorer has to be oriented in just the right fashion to see how much fits through there. Now it still feels like there's way too much clearance on that lingual side. Yeah, I'd say there's... Okay, so coming from inside the prep, down that wall. Well, okay, now I'm getting it binding a little bit more. Yeah, I think there's close to 1 millimeter, maybe 0.7 or 8 right there on the lingual side. That's not as much as I had at first thought. Facial clearance is less than that. We talked about that before. Okay, so we go back again. There's that undercut axial wall. That little short wall down there gingivally. Okay, hold on a second here, because I think that Yeah, that buccal clearance. Here's a little edge again. Yeah, it's less than it is on the lingual. Okay, exit angles. We talked about some apparent acute angles on parts of both the facial and the lingual. The curvature on the facial, the lingual side. There's a lot of curvature toward the occlusal. On the lingual side, so I'm feeling a definite need to use a hand instrument over there. On the facial wall, toward the occlusal, it's hard to feel that area because, again, with that undercut axial wall, there's not as much of that facial wall to feel. But I'm not real confident about that exit angle on the facial, and again, it's hard to detect it well when I can't get my explorer all the way around that margin toward the occlusal part of the facial wall. It's rough, it's not real flat, but I think it's probably pretty close to 90 down at the gingival. We talked about a little bit of a hook and the need for a hand instrument. That's the facial side of that box. Of course, nothing that relates to a retentive groove, and we talked about the gingival clearance probably being none at all. Okay, I think that's about the clearest picture I can get of that prep. Now, how does it really look? Okay, that's interesting. I had the facial clearance worked out pretty well. The lingual clearance is better than I thought. There's a little more lingual clearance than I thought. Gingival clearance, still nothing. The axial wall is undercut toward the facial. And but not as dramatic as I thought it was from feel, but it's still there. And that does make that facial wall a little bit small. Marginal ridge position, I don't actually mind that as much as I was feeling. I had indicated that it was too close to the top of the marginal ridge. Now that I look and feel at the same time, it seems like there's a little more elevation between the margin and the marginal ridge. It's better than it was on the number 12, which I didn't really check that. That one I should have checked, and I neglected to check the undercut of that marginal ridge on number 12 also. 5 has a better angulation. I should have slid the explorer up that wall a little bit more carefully with a sense of which direction the wall is leaning. I didn't quite catch that on either one of these. I could probably do a little bit better at it next time on that score. Okay, well that gets interesting. I think the only thing on that one that I didn't read quite right was the clearance on lingual. At one point I thought it was pretty, I guess I did finally come back and say it's 0.7 or 8, and I guess that's about what it is actually. At one point I thought it was too tight, but it feels pretty good here. But gingival clearly not there. All right, that's fun.